I'm going to start off tonight by sharing a story of three women that will paint a picture of what many women and girls suffer and challenge with every time they have their menstruation. This first picture is of Alice. Alice is from Nakuru, Kenya. And when Alice was in high school, she was sitting at her desk and had a surprise visitor from her period. As the day went on, she knew she had stained her uniform. And as luck would have it, the teacher said, "Alice, I want you to come to the board and answer a question." And Alice said she had to make a decision in that second. Do I get up and risk being laughed at and humiliated in front of my peers because I've stained myself? Or do I receive the punishment from the teacher for being seen as disrespectful? She said she knew what the answer was. She received a slap from the teacher for being disrespectful, and she said, I couldn't explain why. She would rather have received that than been humiliated by her peers. Sadly, this incident would go on for Alice throughout her high school years. She didn't have money. Her family didn't have money to provide her with menstrual products, so she would use leaves and rags. She said it even sometimes got so bad she would rip her textbook pages out to make proxy menstrual products. She said one day was the worst, and it was the day that she sat for her national exam in Kenya that would determine what university she would go to or if she could go. She said that day her period came, and like usual, she did not have a menstrual product. She said the whole time that she was taking the exam, all she could think about was, are my rags working? Am I going to stand up and be humiliated? And then that led to her to be saying, Alice, you should be focusing on the test. And in the end, she failed the test and wasn't able to go to university the way that she had planned, all because of her period. The next slide is a friend of mine named Eunice, who's from Lilongwe, Malawi. And Eunice was 15 years old when she woke up one morning soaked in blood. What do we think of when we have blood? We usually think of an injury or something bad, and that's exactly what Eunice thought. She screamed to her mom, "Mom, come, something's wrong." Her mom comes running, and as she goes in, she goes, "What's wrong?" And Eunice explains, and she said, immediately her mom got mad and said, "You have been with bad company and boys. What are you doing?" And Eunice was like, "Why am I in trouble? I don't even know." And her mom said, "Go to your grandma's right now and tell her what's happened." Eunice said she was so confused. She got up, went to her grandma's, explained what happened. Her grandma went and gathered all the elder women in the village, and they all brought Eunice in and began to tell her that she was no longer a little girl. They said, "You are now a woman. You cannot play with boys. You cannot sit by boys." And they gave her this long list of everything that she could not do, but they didn't explain what was wrong. Eunice said she left so confused at what was happening and went to bed that night thinking, I hope this day is never repeated. The next morning, she woke up again with blood covered, called her mom, and her mom came in. She said, "Mom, it's happened again." And her mother said, "Get used to it. This is going to happen the rest of your life." Eunice said, she said to me, at that moment, I would have, quote, rather died than lived my life like that the rest of my life, unquote. So unfortunately for Eunice, no one told her what it was. No one provided her with education on how to manage this. And she said her self-esteem plummeted. She said she didn't dare go to school. She was being teased. She eventually dropped out of school. And she said, I really suffered confidence and really had self-blame, not figuring out what was going on. Again, from something normal and natural. The next person I want to introduce you to is Christine, who's from Nairobi, Kenya. Much like Alice and Eunice, when she was 14 years old, she had a stepmother, and her stepmother didn't prepare her about menstruation, and she had her period come. And much like the others, she had no way to manage it. But she would still go to school, soil herself, be teased, but she kept going to school. Finally, someone in the community recognized her plight and said to her, "Please, let me help you. I will give you some reusable pads, but come to me every month to get these." So she did, and by month 2 or month 3, this person said to her, "So you need to pay me for these pads now." And Christine said, I don't have any money. And he said, "Okay, then you need to do sexual transactions for me to give these to you." she felt she had no choice. She wanted to stay in school and not be humiliated, so she did. She did sexual transactions. Later that year, Christine ended up pregnant, which then she was kicked out of her home. And so at 14, she was homeless, pregnant, on the streets of Nairobi for her period. Sadly, these stories are reflective of many, many people. One study in Kenya showed that 2 out of 3 girls in rural areas who are using disposable pads are getting them from sexual transactions. Here in Uganda, 25% of girls surveyed in rural villages said they're getting theirs for sexual transactions as well. And also, my daughter Jenna made a friend with some local girls who were going to government schools. And when they found out that Jenna, we'll talk about it in a minute, does some period advocacy work, they said, "Oh, we know that's real." One of them said, "One of my good friends, her family can't afford the menstrual products, and so she's getting her supplies by doing sexual acts with boda drivers just long enough to get through school. That was her plan." Well, much like Christine, this girl ended up getting pregnant, and now her chance of education is gone. So sadly, this is a story. These stories, as I said, are reflective of girls and women around the world. Next slide. I wanted to share one other thing that happens. When we don't have accurate information, communities tend to build stories to make sense of things. And so this picture, the person in the middle in the black coat is my organization's country manager who is in Nepal. And Maya is working to do away with a harmful practice called chapati, which happens in the very rural areas and mountainous areas of Nepal. Next slide. This practice has come about from lack of information, of understanding what menstruation is. The women feel they've been cursed, and the society tells them that the blood is harmful, and if they stay in the home, that they can cause harm to their family, they can have the cattle or their animals die, their gardens can go bad. And I want to say here, there's no judgment, because if someone told me that would happen to my family, I would take every means to protect them. So having accurate information is so important. But without that, they think the best they can do is isolate the women and girls to these chapati huts. And let's think, this is in the Himalayas, and it's in the middle of the winter, and these girls are there until they are done with their periods, so anywhere between 3 to 7 days, and the women as well. The government, recognizing that there were so many deaths every year from this practice, went to all the rural areas and the mountainous villages, and they tore down the chapati huts. Unfortunately, they didn't bring education. They didn't tell the villagers that menstruation is normal, it's natural, it's not a curse. And so as soon as the government officials left, they built new huts like this. And Maya, the women in this village, felt comfortable sharing these huts with her because she had just educated them after years of going there that this is something that's not normal and natural. And so now they don't use them in that village. Next slide. So this is a problem you can see that is cross-cutting. It hits everywhere in the world. And right now, in the world, there are 1.2 billion women and girls and people of reproductive age. So people who are of reproductive age. Next slide. Of the 1.2 billion, 500 million don't have what they need to manage their periods. So let's put that into perspective. 500 million people. That's basically the entire population of Mexico, the United States, and Canada. So can you imagine being one of those people that wakes up in the morning every month, having your period, not knowing what it is, having access to product? So I think if I were to do a poll here, I could ask the women and girls in the room, have you ever had a surprise visit from your period? Have you been caught without products? I think people would raise their hand. And you know that moment of panic. What am I going to do? I was thinking about the boys and the men here. It's really hard for you to understand what that could be. And so my best example would be, imagine a bloody nose. A bloody nose comes on spontaneously. You can't control the bleeding. It just comes. Now say you're at school or at work and it comes and you forgot to bring toilet paper or you forgot to bring a Kleenex and it's just pouring. How can you focus on your job or on the assignment at hand when this is happening? You can now get a glimpse. Now magnify that and think, this is a girl or a woman who wakes up from the time, let's say they're 11 to 45, 55 till menopause, their first period to the end. This is going to happen every month, 3 to 7 days until menopause. Can you imagine trying to manage that while still performing at school, while still performing at work? You can see the gender inequality here. And add on top of that, the social norms that say we shouldn't be talking about periods. They're private, they're secretive, and often considered shameful. But yet none of us would be here without them. So as people are becoming more and more aware of this problem, the menstrual health experts in the field came together a few years ago and said, let's get a definition of what is menstrual health. Because one thing I hope you leave here knowing, it's not just about products. Next slide. So the first thing that is needed is education and information. You can see from Maya and from Christine's story and from Alice's, lack of accurate information can cause confusion and harmful practices. So we need education, not just for the women and girls, but for the boys and men as well. Next slide. We also need facilities. You know, think about it. At ISU, you're so lucky. We have so many amazing clean bathrooms girls can go to and staff and manage their periods. I'm working on a project in South Africa where there are 700 kids in a school with one pit latrine. Can you imagine at school and you're on your period trying to get in that one pit latrine? There's no running water. Sometimes, like the person in the field said, there's like a door that half fits there. So you're trying to manage this at school. You can see the barrier that would cause. And also they need access to services such as menstrual products. Next slide. They also need a positive environment. We need to have women and girls not feel that they're laughed at or shamed or embarrassed or pushed back because of something that's normal and natural. We need to have positive environments. Next slide. This one is care and treatment, and this is something that's really coming to light as people are becoming more and more courageous to talk about their periods. And this is the idea that when a woman has pain during their period, typically people say, oh, just take an Advil, or just be tough, you can do it, you've got it. But that is not the case. There are many, many women and girls who suffer significant atypical pain that would put anyone on the couch. I debated whether to share this or not, but I'm going to. In my years of doing advocacy work for menstrual health, I just learned something last week that blew me away, I didn't know about. Many women on a period, the chemical or the hormone that's released when we have diarrhea, for 8% of women on their period, this triggers that hormone. So can you imagine they're on their period and now they have diarrhea on top of that for the entire time they're menstruating. That's 8% of women. So there are atypical things that are happening that we can't just tell women, just be tough, you can do it. Next one. We want to have the freedom to allow women and girls to participate in anything they want when they're on their period. We don't want to tell them, you can't do that because you're on your period, or you shouldn't do that. To have gender equality, we have to allow women to decide, and girls, is this something I'm comfortable participating in or not? But allow them the freedom of doing that. So you can see, to have menstrual health and to have a woman and a girl manage it with dignity requires several things. Now, as we're learning more and more research is coming out, we're seeing the cost of ignoring it is significant. Next slide. There's health challenges. As Alice said, she used textbooks, rags, newspapers. She said she was constantly having reproductive infections. One study in Tanzania showed that the girls who were using proxy menstrual products were 4 times more likely to have infections because of that, which you can imagine. Maybe you saw the other day, 2 weeks, 3 weeks ago, in Jinja, girls were using sand and putting it in plastic bag and punching holes. And our partner, Care International, went out and investigated it, and it is happening. And imagine the infections and then the cost on the healthcare system for that, and women and girls missing school and work because of that. The next one, early childhood marriages. For some reason, in many, many cultures, when a girl has her period, they're seen as time to get married. You're now an adult, and they get married off, which we know then they're pulled out of school. The education stops. They have more children. They're more likely to be in poverty, which then has an impact across the entire country. Next slide. There's shame and isolation. As we talked about in Nepal, many, many countries have practices where girls are banned outside of the home or in the room. They're not allowed to participate. And not only that, even in high-income countries, people are embarrassed to talk about this. And that has a cost. It has a cost on self-confidence. It has a cost on the way goals people set, on how they're being treated. Next slide. Also, I don't know if some of you are familiar with this term presentism. Presentism is a term that happened to Alice that I talked about. You are here in body, but your mind is somewhere else. And that happens to many people who menstruate. They might be at school, but they are so worried about getting teased if they're soiled or what's going to happen, or if they're in pain, or to their boss, they can't tell their boss that I have abnormal menstrual pain, what's going to happen. And so they can be there, but not as productive. Absenteeism, as many of you might know, girls are missing school, maybe not just for product, but because there's no facility at this where they can manage it. So many things, but all of those are barriers that hold them back and impact their career choices. Then the last one is decreased productivity, which I just touched on, that they aren't as productive when they are in environments where they're not being treated with products, education, and supportive environments. So as I talk about this, you might be thinking, well, Diana, that's like really sad, but I actually have everything I need. But you know, this issue is cross-cutting. It's not just in low to mid-income countries. Plan International did a study in the UK where they asked girls from 14 to 21, do you have problems accessing menstrual products? And 1 out of 10 said they couldn't access it. I lived in South Africa in a really nice area in Pretoria, and a woman there, her husband had lost the job, they were struggling, they had 4 girls, all menstruating, and the mother told me one day, she said, you know what, we don't have enough products for me to buy for everyone, so I go without. I give all to my girls, and I just stay at home on the days that I menstruate. That was shocking. And then one other experience hits really close to home because it's an experience I had that I'm embarrassed to admit, but I want to share with you. When I didn't know about period poverty, I didn't know these issues existed until about 8 years ago. I was for another job at a conference, and the keynote speaker there was talking about this, and I instantly had a flashback to my freshman year in college of one of my roommates. There were 5 of us in an apartment, and this one roommate was very quiet. She'd sneak in late at night, leave early in the morning. And as I learned about this, I flashed back to seeing homemade pads out of our toilet paper. And as an 18-year-old, I'm so embarrassed to admit this, but I remember telling myself, she is so cheap. I cannot believe she's using our toilet paper to make pads. And it wasn't until 30 plus years later when I realized she wasn't cheap, she couldn't afford it. And the shame and the stigma that surrounded that did not allow her to feel comfortable to tell all of her 5 roommates who had plenty of products that we could have shared. I was mortified that I had lived with someone that was suffering from that. So what can you do? Maybe right now there's nothing, you have everything that you need, but I can guarantee that there's someone within your sphere, maybe at work or in the community, that doesn't have what they need. So what you can do is have a conversation. Never underestimate the power of a conversation. As when they introduced, Jenna, my daughter, was here, and I called her and told her about this TED Talk, and she said, Mom, and I was asking her, because she did a lot of period work here, and she said in grade 10, she did her NYP personal work on period poverty. And then the school was so gracious and let her teach the 7th graders. I don't know if there's any of you out there now. They're probably grade 10. But she went in and taught them about period poverty. And she said, Mom, the whole key is you got to be confident. If you're confident talking about periods, then other people will feel comfortable. But if you're uncomfortable, they're going to be uncomfortable. And she said, I just went in and I taught those kids, and she said they had so many questions, and none of them had heard about period poverty. And they had so many great questions. And then she was so empowered by that and inspired that the next year, she and some of her friends did a club, and the school again was so lovely, and they let them do morning announcements. And a few times they would put on period facts on the morning announcements. And then she would have conversations with her friends about period and show them the products, the boys. And I think what that did is it normalized it, right? And now all these people, and hopefully ISU, this isn't something to be embarrassed of. It's not anything to be shame someone or laugh at anybody for happening. And so I want to end where I started. If you could go to this last slide. This is Eunice. Do you remember at the beginning I started with her story? This is Eunice with the First Lady. And I wanted to end with when Eunice did drop out of school, and it wasn't till her early 20s that she went back to school and graduated, but she said when she learned what periods were and that they were normal and natural, she said, I decided I couldn't let anybody suffer like I suffered and have that shame and guilt and depression. So she read up on everything she could. She became an expert. She talked to everybody. And as she did that, people got to know her, and it finally got to the point where she was able, we were able to partner with the First Lady of Malawi to address menstrual health in Malawi, all because of Eunice having conversations. So my challenge today is, please leave this TED Talk and in the next few days have one conversation with someone about period poverty, something you learned from this talk. Together we can change this stigma associated with menstruation so that women and girls throughout the world can manage it with dignity. Thank you.